labelled what they view as the success of the anti-gang unit just months since it was introduced. Police Minister Bheki Cele, together with his counterparts, gave feedback to the Portfolio Committee in Parliament yesterday. Now, a total of 79 projects are currently running, with over 300 arrests having been made and several firearms confiscated. The unit is a national approach, which is a collaboration between the police, civil society and community members, with the aim of putting an end to gangsterism and drugs. And to discuss this further, joining us now via Skype is Dr Kelly Gillespsie, who's the senior lecturer at the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at the University of the Western Cape. And Dr Gillespsie, thanks so much for speaking to us this morning, and welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
I think there's a general consensus that this is definitely a step in the right direction over something over which there's been a huge outcry over many years, and the perception has been that the powers that be, government and the authorities, don't really care. But just looking at what was taking place yesterday, what would you say has been the success of this anti-gang unit and what they are doing currently?
Thanks for the question. I think what is positive is that we see national government taking the gang situation in the country seriously. And that hasn't been the case often. And it's very important that we understand how drastic conditions are in communities where there are very high rates of gang violence. What I would say are the positives is that you firstly have a national conversation going on about gangs. And secondly, that there is action in those communities that tries to draw some of the lifeblood away from gangs. So I think the gun raids and the drug raids are extremely important and have direct impact on the levels of violence and the health and well-being, particularly of young people in those areas. What I would say, though, is that we've seen over the history of policing and action around and against gangs in South Africa, these moments of sporadic arrests and sporadic interventions to try and eradicate gangs in the country. What happens, however, is that in the short term, there's often a decrease in gang activity in those areas. But when superficial interventions, such as the incarceration of high-level gang members or the increase of policing presence on the streets is increased, you have a situation where gang members get to regroup in prison. People often think about prison as a place where you can solve problems, where people get better, where you take the problem off the streets. But in fact, if you understand the dynamics in prison, you understand that prison becomes a very important networking place for gang leaders, for drug leaders, for the integration of the drug economy and the gang economy in these neighborhoods. So often these mass arrests do exactly the opposite of what is imagined that they will do. So it's extremely important to understand that higher levels of policing and prison cannot be the answer to endemic gang violence, because what happens is often in the long run, they simply exacerbate the problem. Now, I think in many cases, people living in those neighborhoods see prisons and see policing as, in terms of the temporary relief that they provide. But we've seen historically that as soon as those people come out of prison, as soon as members that they've been able to recruit come out of prison, there's simply a deepening of the system of gangsterism and drug war in those neighborhoods. So I think what's very important to ask is how we, in the long term, change the social conditions in which gangs and the drug economy thrive. And the only way to do that is by systematic redevelopment of the social conditions in those neighborhoods. Because gangs, unfortunately, as much as they produce high levels of violence in those neighborhoods, also serve as a kind of welfarist provision in neighborhoods that have been wrecked by increasing unemployment, long histories of displacement, very high rates of household violence and domestic violence. And the social conditions in those neighborhoods are such that people, when there isn't anything else to turn to gangs for uniforms for soccer clubs, for small employment in the drug economy, for matric dance dresses, for school fees. And so gangs use those social conditions to recruit membership and to convince the families and the parents of those young people to allow for gangs to take root in those neighborhoods.
Now,
so unless there is deep political commitment to changing the social conditions in those neighborhoods, no superficial prison and policing intervention is going to really undo the deeper conditions in which gangs have historically done extremely well in terms of developing membership.
That all sounds rather deflating, I must say. The minister himself admitting that gangsterism is a social issue, as you yourself point out. And the question then is, just how deeply rooted is this gangsterism? You speak about what happens in the prison system, also about the police and the role that they play. And there is, of course, that deficit, the trust deficit that exists between the police and, of course, the communities. And we saw a number of members of this very unit that was established being reportedly arrested after being found to be working with the gangs. So where does the solution lie in the long term? What
I've
meaningful...
lost sound, I'm afraid.
Dr. Gillespsie, can you hear me now? No, she can't. So, Dr. Kelly Gillespsie there, unfortunately, we seem to have lost our connection to Dr. Gillespsie there. Talking about gangsterism in our communities and, of course, what the interventions are. We're going to try and get Dr. Gillespsie back, but in the meantime, just looking at what she said, talking about how prisons where people are supposed to go to be rehabilitated actually serve as some would call them, institutions of higher learning for gangsterism and other crimes, where people seem to graduate to even higher levels of these crimes that they may have been sent to prison for. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll see if we can get Dr. Gillespsie back.